Picture this, if you will. The year is 1718, and Nassau Harbor in the Bahamas has become something absolutely extraordinary. 200 pirate vessels crowd these waters, 200 each one, flying the black flag of piracy, each one a testament to the so-called golden age that's reached its absolute zenith. Now, when you hear that number, when you imagine 200 ships packed into a single harbor, you might think this represents the peak of pirate power, right? The ultimate expression of organized lawlessness in the Caribbean, and on the surface, you would be correct. But here's the thing about surfaces: they lie. Because beneath those fearsome black flags, beneath the swagger and the reputation and the very real terror these ships inspire in merchant captains from Jamaica to Charleston, there exists a crisis so fundamental, so absolutely devastating, that it threatens to collapse the entire pirate enterprise from within. These ships, you see, are dying. Not metaphorically. Literally dying, rotting away from the inside out, while their crews remain blissfully unaware that they're sailing aboard what amounts to floating coffins. Go below deck on any one of these vessels, anyone at all. The experience is the same, and it's horrifying. The darkness down there isn't just dark, it's thick, suffocating, heavy with moisture and decay. You can taste it in your mouth. Men wake up in their hammocks to discover rats gnawing on their toes. Not nibbling, gnawing. These aren't the occasional ship rats of merchant vessels. These are armies of vermin that have claimed the lower decks as their kingdom, and they defend their territory with a boldness that borders on aggressive. Cockroaches rain down from the timbers above, and I mean rain falling into the rum rations, scuttling across sleeping faces, infesting every corner, every crack, every crevice. And the ships themselves? They're being eaten alive. See, there's this creature called the shipworm. Despite its name, it's actually a type of mollusk, but that distinction means absolutely nothing to the wooden hull it's devouring. These things bore through ship timbers like you or I might bite through bread. They tunnel through oak planks 2 inches thick, creating a honeycomb of destruction that's invisible from the outside until suddenly, catastrophically, it isn't. A ship that terrorizes merchant vessels for 3 months, capturing prize after prize, making its captain rich and feared, that same ship becomes a worthless hulk within 6 months. 6 months. The timeline is staggering when you really consider it. The life cycle of a pirate vessel in 1718 looks like this. Capture or steal a ship, outfit it for piracy, enjoy maybe 3 to 4 months of operational effectiveness, then watch helplessly as it falls apart. The hull becomes so compromised that it starts taking on water even in calm seas. The crews, already weakened by tropical diseases, find themselves battling pestilence spread by the vermin that outnumber them 3 to 1. Scurvy, typhus, dysentery. These aren't just medical problems. They're existential threats magnified by the unsanitary conditions that the rats and insects make exponentially worse. Now, every pirate captain knows this. Every single one. They accept it as an immutable fact of their profession, like the risk of hanging or the unpredictability of Caribbean storms. You get a few good months from a ship, you capture what you can, and then you need to find another vessel to steal. It's built into their business model, if you can call it that. Every captain accepts this reality. Every captain except one. Enter Jack Bartholomew, former metalworker's apprentice from Bristol. Not born to the sea, not raised on ships, not descended from a long line of sailors or pirates or maritime anything. His background is forges and foundries, hammers and anvils, the precise art of working with copper and bronze and tin. His hands bear the scars of his apprenticeship, burn marks from hot metal, cuts from sharp edges, the permanent discoloration that comes from years of handling copper compounds. These hands know metal in a way that most sailors never will. How Bartholomew ended up in the Caribbean, how he transitioned from metalworking to piracy, that's a story for another time. What matters now, what brings us to the moment that will change everything, is what he's learned since arriving in these waters. See, Bartholomew has spent time with the Taino divers of Cuba, not enslaving them, not fighting them, not exploiting them, learning from them. These indigenous people showed him something their ancestors knew, a secret passed down through generations. They used copper to protect their sacred canoes, wrapped copper around certain parts of the wood, and those canoes lasted for decades while untreated vessels rotted in seasons. Bartholomew also encountered an aged Portuguese captain in a tavern in Havana. Old man, deep in his cups and nostalgic for his younger days, told stories of Phoenician ships from ancient times, vessels that sailed the Mediterranean for decade after decade without succumbing to decay. Ships that, according to legend, had been treated with copper in ways the old captain couldn't quite explain but swore were real. 2 pieces of knowledge, one from the indigenous people of the Caribbean, one from ancient maritime history. Bartholomew, with his metalworker's mind, saw the connection. So now it's 1718, and Bartholomew captains a ship called Serpent's Dream. To the casual observer, it looks like any other pirate vessel, but it isn't, not even close. The notorious Charles Vane, and if you know Caribbean piracy, you know that name discovers this truth during a midnight parley. Vane boards Serpent's Dream expecting the usual, the stench of decay, the scurrying of rats, the humid rot that characterizes every ship in these waters. Instead, he finds something impossible. The planks beneath his boots are dry, bone dry. In the middle of storm season, he goes below deck, and there are no rat droppings. None. The air doesn't reek of death and decomposition. It smells like tar and salt and wood, but clean wood, preserved wood. Vane is nobody's fool. He knows what this means. He knows the fortune that could be made with ships that don't rot, that can operate for years instead of months. He presses his pistol against Bartholomew's temple, the cold metal of the barrel a point of punctuation in his demand. "Tell me," he says, "tell me your secret." But Bartholomew has learned something beyond metalworking, beyond copper application. He's learned that knowledge is power only when it remains yours alone. He refuses. The confrontation escalates rapidly. Vane's men, desperate and envious, and thinking they can tear apart the ship's hull to discover its secrets, begin attacking the vessel itself. They start prying at planks, searching for whatever treatment or magic or devil's bargain keeps this ship pristine. Bartholomew's crew responds with violence because what choice do they have? When men try to destroy your ship, you defend it. 12 of Vane's pirates die in the fighting that night. 12 men, including 2 who Vane personally valued above all others in his crew. When the battle finally ends, when Vane retreats to his own rotting flagship, a line has been drawn in Caribbean waters. Jack Bartholomew isn't just another pirate captain. He's the man who guards his knowledge with blood, who possesses a secret that could revolutionize piracy itself, and who has just made an enemy of one of the most dangerous men in Nassau. But here's what Charles Vane doesn't yet understand, what none of them understand. Bartholomew's copper-sheathed hulls don't just prevent rot and discourage vermin, they create something unprecedented in Caribbean waters. Something that will, within 4 years, completely transform naval warfare and ultimately lead to the end of the pirate age itself. The secret isn't just protection, it's speed. So we've established that Bartholomew has this secret, right? This copper treatment that keeps his ship from rotting. But here's where things get really interesting, where we see the difference between someone who stumbles onto an advantage and someone who understands how to build an empire from it. The year is now 1719, and the Spanish treasure fleet is making its annual voyage from Cartagena to Havana. Every pirate in the Caribbean knows about this fleet. It's the dream target, the ultimate prize. Ships laden with gold doubloons, silver ingots, precious gems from the South American mines. When word spreads that the treasure fleet is coming, pirate captains start salivating. They start planning elaborate ambushes and coordinated attacks. Jack Bartholomew hears about the treasure fleet too, but he's not interested in the gold. He's interested in something the other. Pirates don't even consider valuable. See, near Santiago de Cuba, the Spanish operate copper mines, not glamorous mines producing gold or silver, just copper. The kind of resource that most pirates would sail right past without a second thought. But Bartholomew knows something they don't. He knows that copper, in his hands, is worth more than gold could ever be. Gold buys you temporary wealth. Copper buys you permanent operational superiority. So while every other pirate in the Caribbean is planning to intercept the treasure fleet at sea, Bartholomew is planning something entirely different. He's planning a land raid on the copper mines themselves. This is audacious for several reasons. First, Spanish mining operations are heavily guarded. Second, even if you capture the mine, copper is heavy. We're talking about ore and ingots that weigh hundreds of pounds. You can't just stuff it in your pockets and run. Third, and this is crucial, Bartholomew needs to get to these mines through miles of Cuban jungle, through terrain that the Spanish know and control. But here's where Bartholomew demonstrates another quality that separates him from typical pirates. He listens to people that others ignore. He's spent time talking with escaped slaves, with indigenous guides, with anyone who knows the Cuban interior. These people, these individuals that Spanish authorities dismiss and other pirates would never think to consult, they know the mountains around Santiago better than any Spanish guard ever will. They know paths that don't appear on colonial maps, routes through the jungle that avoid military patrols. Bartholomew leads 40 men on this expedition, 40 men through tropical jungle in the middle of summer heat. The journey takes 8 days. 8 days of mosquitoes and snakes and plants with thorns that inject poison into your skin. 8 days of rationing water and eating whatever you can catch or find. His crew begins to question whether any amount of copper is worth this misery. Then they reach the mines. The raid happens at dawn. The Spanish guards, accustomed to threats coming from the sea, never imagine an attack from the jungle side. Bartholomew's men hit them fast and hard, capturing the facility before the Spanish can mount an effective defense. They secure 2 tons of raw copper ore and refined copper ingots. 2 tons, that's 4,000 pounds of copper. And remember, this has to be carried back through the same jungle they just traversed. But the real prize isn't the copper itself, it's Miguel Cervantes. Cervantes is the mine's master smelter, the man who understands how to refine copper ore, how to create different alloys, how to produce copper sheets of varying thicknesses. He spent 20 years perfecting his craft under Spanish supervision. When Bartholomew's men storm his workshop, Cervantes expects to be killed. Instead, Bartholomew offers him a choice. Come with us and teach us your knowledge, or we burn your workshop, with you inside it. It's not really a choice. Cervantes goes with them. The journey back to the coast takes 9 days longer than the journey there because they're hauling 4,000 pounds of copper. Men take turns carrying the loads, and by the time they reach Bartholomew's ship, every one of them has bloody shoulders and backs scraped raw. But they've done it. They've successfully raided a Spanish copper mine and escaped with both the resource and the expertise to use it properly. Now comes the transformation. Cervantes, initially sullen and resistant, begins to see something unexpected in Bartholomew's operation. This isn't just a pirate crew. It's diverse in a way that's genuinely unusual for 1719. There are freed African divers who know how to work underwater, Irish sailors who understand Atlantic sailing conditions, indigenous Caribbean guides who can navigate by stars and currents. There's even a defrocked Spanish priest named Father Tomas who left the church after witnessing atrocities in the conquest and now sails with pirates, seeking his own form of redemption. Cervantes teaches them how to create copper sheets thin enough to bend around a ship's curves, but thick enough to be structurally sound and toxic to marine life. The sheets need to be approximately 1/16 of an inch thick, any thinner, and they tear during installation. Any thicker, and they're too rigid to conform to the hull's shape. This precision requires skill that takes weeks to develop. But creating the copper sheets is only part of the process. Installing them is an entirely different challenge, and this is where Bartholomew's diverse crew becomes absolutely crucial. The African divers, many of them formerly enslaved pearl divers who escaped Spanish captivity, can hold their breath for times that seem impossible. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, there are accounts of some going 5 minutes without surfacing. They can work at depths where the water pressure makes European sailors' ears bleed. They're the ones who actually attach the copper plates to the ship's hull underwater. The process becomes a ritual. First, the ship is careened, tilted on its side in shallow water so part of the hull is exposed. The exposed section gets cleaned completely, every barnacle scraped off, every bit of weed removed. Then comes the copper application. Each plate overlaps the next by exactly half an inch, creating a scale-like pattern that leaves no gaps for shipworms to penetrate. The plates are attached using copper nails, never iron, because iron and copper create a galvanic reaction that causes corrosion. Here's where it gets really interesting. The crew discovers something through trial and error. There's a place in Trinidad where natural tar bubbles up from the ground. They call it the pitch lake. This tar, when mixed with crushed copper dust, creates a paste that can be applied between the copper plates. The paste is toxic to any organism that tries to bore through it, and it seals gaps that even the most careful installation might miss. They also discover timing matters. The copper must be applied during the full moon when tides are at their highest. Why? Because the tidal variation helps them careen the ship more easily and ensures that the lowest part of the hull gets treated properly. This becomes part of the ritual. Father Tomas actually blesses each copper plate before installation, praying over them in a mixture of Latin and Taino phrases that would probably get him executed for heresy if any church official heard them. The first ship to receive the full copper treatment takes 7 days to complete. 7 days of coordinated effort, where every person has a specific role, and the failure of any one person could compromise the entire installation. When they finish, when the ship slides back into the water fully coppered, Bartholomew renames it. It becomes Eternal Serpent. And that ship changes everything. The speed is dramatic. We're talking about a vessel that cuts through Caribbean waters like nothing these sailors have ever experienced. Where a traditional ship might make the voyage from Nassau to Havana in 2 weeks, Eternal Serpent does it in 5 days. 5 days. Think about what that means tactically. You can intercept merchant vessels that don't even know you're in the area. You can escape from naval patrols that can't possibly catch you. You can cover twice the territory, hit twice as many targets, and be gone before anyone can mount a response. Word spreads through the pirate brotherhood like yellow fever, and suddenly every captain in Nassau wants Bartholomew's secret. They offer him money, partnerships, shares of future prizes. Some threaten violence. But Bartholomew, demonstrating the strategic thinking that will define his brief but spectacular career, shares his knowledge selectively. He chooses loyalty over reputation. Anne Bonny, yes, that Anne Bonny receives the copper treatment for her sloop after she saves Bartholomew's life in a tavern brawl in Port Royal. 3 men tried to knife him in an alley, and Bonny appeared out of nowhere with pistols blazing. Loyalty like that gets rewarded. But when Edward Teach Blackbeard himself, the most famous pirate in the Caribbean, approaches Bartholomew asking for the secret, Bartholomew refuses. Why? Because Blackbeard represents the old way of piracy, theatrical, violent for violence's sake, more interested in reputation than results. The 2 men meet in Nassau, and the confrontation becomes legendary. Blackbeard threatens to burn Bartholomew's ships. Bartholomew tells him to try. Neither man backs down, and the rivalry that forms will define Caribbean piracy's final years. By 1727, ships fly Bartholomew's personal flag, a serpent wrapped around a copper coin. 7 copper-hulled vessels operating as a coordinated fleet. And these ships capture more merchant prizes in 6 months than traditional pirate operations take in 2 years. The mathematics are staggering. Traditional pirates might successfully raid 4 or 5 merchant vessels in a year. Bartholomew's copper fleet averages 15 captures per ship annually. The speed advantage means they can chase down vessels that would normally escape. The durability means they don't need to waste time constantly searching for replacement ships. The absence of disease means crews stay healthy and operational. But success on this scale creates its own problems, because now Bartholomew isn't just another pirate captain. He's become a threat to the entire colonial system. The British, the Spanish, the French, they're all starting to notice that something unprecedented is happening in Caribbean waters, and they're starting to wonder what they need to do about it. What they don't realize yet is that the hurricane season of 1721 is about to hand Bartholomew an opportunity so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that it will make him the absolute master of the Caribbean. For exactly 3 months, September 1721. Remember that date, because what happens in this month will fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Caribbean and set in motion the events that will ultimately end the golden age of piracy itself. The hurricane arrives on September 9th. Now, the Caribbean sees hurricanes regularly, they're part of life in these waters. Sailors know the signs, the particular quality of light on the horizon, the way birds behave, the feeling in the air that tells you something massive is coming. But this storm, this particular hurricane, is different. This is the kind of storm that appears once in a generation, the kind that old sailors tell stories about decades later, with genuine fear still visible in their eyes. Witnesses, and we have multiple documented accounts from survivors, claim they saw things that sound like pure fiction. Sharks lifted from the sea and deposited inland. Not small sharks. We're talking about sharks weighing hundreds of pounds, found the next morning in the governor's garden in Nassau, a quarter-mile from the water. Trees that had stood for a century torn from the ground like weeds. Ships lifted bodily and thrown onto shore, or into buildings, or onto other ships. Nassau Harbour in 1721 is crowded. Remember, this is still the pirate capital of the Caribbean. But it's not just pirate vessels in the harbour that day. There are British warships. The Royal Navy maintains a presence here, trying to impose some kind of order. There are merchant vessels waiting out the traditional sailing season, hoping to avoid the worst of the hurricane months. There are Spanish ships, French ships, vessels from ports all over the Atlantic world. On September 9th, 1721, Nassau Harbour contains approximately 140 ships of various sizes and purposes. The hurricane hits at midday, the wind, speed, and we can only estimate this because obviously they didn't have modern measuring equipment, likely exceeded 150 miles per hour. Sustained winds at that speed don't just damage ships, they obliterate them. Watch what happens. A British warship, HMS Portsmouth, 74 guns, one of the most powerful vessels in the Caribbean, simply breaks apart. The hull splits down the middle. Not gradually, it splits catastrophically. In seconds, spilling crew and cannon and supplies into water that's churning so violently that nothing on the surface survives. The Spanish merchantman Santa Teresa gets lifted up. Eyewitnesses swear this happened, lifted up and thrown onto the dock, crushing 2 smaller vessels beneath it. A pirate sloop gets impaled on a church steeple. The ship somehow got lifted high enough and blown far enough inland that it ended up on top of a church. The destruction is comprehensive. By the time the hurricane passes, and these storms usually move through in 6 to 8 hours, Nassau Harbour looks like a graveyard. Masts stick up from underwater wrecks at odd angles. Hulls are scattered across beaches and streets. The debris field extends for miles. Bodies float in water, thick with wreckage and sewage and blood. Here's the crucial detail. The worm-eaten hulls of traditional ships offer no resistance to this kind of violence. These vessels that were already compromised, already weakened by months of shipworm damage and rot, they shatter like rotten fruit when the hurricane hits them. The structural integrity just isn't there. It's like the difference between hitting a healthy tree with an axe versus hitting a tree that's already hollow with termite damage. One takes sustained effort to fell. The other collapses at the first strong blow. Every ship in Nassau Harbour is destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Every ship except one group. Bartholomew's copper fleet. When dawn breaks on September 10th, when survivors emerge from shelter to survey the devastation, they find something impossible. 7 ships sitting intact in the harbour. Not undamaged, the storm was too powerful for that. Rigging is torn. Sails are shredded. There's cosmetic damage to railings and deck structures. But the hulls are sound. The ships are operational. Bartholomew's copper-hulled vessels, reinforced by the metal plating that saved them from shipworms, proved strong enough to deflect the debris that punctured every other vessel in the harbour. Think about what this means. In the span of 8 hours, Bartholomew has gone from commanding one pirate fleet among many to commanding the only operational naval force within 500 miles. The British warships that were hunting him? Destroyed. The Spanish vessels that represented colonial power? Destroyed. Rival pirate captains who threatened his monopoly on copper technology? Their ships are kindling scattered across Bahamian beaches. Bartholomew suddenly holds the Ares so maris, the hold parliament, when the Norwinder strindings have obeyed, when the save to save, when the Norwinder staged part, absolute maritime supremacy in a region that generates wealth on a scale most people can't imagine. Every merchant ship that survived the hurricane, and some did, caught in other ports or far enough at sea to weather the storm, now has to sail through waters where only Bartholomew has capable warships. Every colonial governor, every military commander, every merchant captain suddenly realizes they're operating in what has effectively become Bartholomew's private sea. This moment, this brief window of absolute power, this is when Bartholomew reaches the peak of his influence. And it's also when the forces that will destroy him begin to coordinate in earnest. See, the colonial powers, British, Spanish, French, they've been competing with each other for decades. They fight wars in Europe that spill over into Caribbean conflicts. They scheme against each other constantly. But Bartholomew's sudden dominance creates something unusual, a common threat significant enough that old enemies start talking to each other. The British Admiralty, operating out of London, makes the first move. They dispatch their cleverest spy. His name is Jonathan Hartwell, and he's perfect for this mission. Hartwell is a legitimate former naval officer who got court-martialed for corruption, accepting bribes from merchant captains, selling naval supplies on the black market, that sort of thing. His disgrace is real, documented, public, which makes him an ideal candidate to infiltrate pirate operations because his story is checkable. When Hartwell shows up in Nassau claiming he's a disgraced officer looking to join the pirate life, people believe him because it's true. Bartholomew, to his credit, is suspicious. He doesn't trust former naval officers on principle. But Hartwell is patient and clever. He spends weeks in Nassau taverns, never pushing too hard, letting other people recommend him. He demonstrates genuine sailing ability. He makes himself useful without being obsequious. Slowly, carefully, he builds a reputation as someone competent and reliable. It takes 3 months before Bartholomew accepts him aboard Eternal Serpent, 3 months of careful manipulation and strategic positioning. And once Hartwell is aboard, he begins his real work. He memorizes everything. The thickness of the copper plates, the spacing of the nails, the composition of the tar mixture from Trinidad, the timing of installation during full moon tides, the role of the African divers. Every single detail of the copper application process gets committed to Hartwell's prodigious memory. But he's clever enough to know that just stealing the technical knowledge isn't enough. He needs to weaken Bartholomew's position before he makes his escape. So Hartwell starts poisoning the crew's minds. Nothing overt that would be too obvious. Instead, he drops hints. Suggests that Bartholomew keeps too much prize money for himself. Mentions that other captains share their secrets more freely. Points out, when Bartholomew makes decisions that benefit the fleet's overall strategy, but might cost individual crew members short-term profit. It's subtle, insidious work, and it's devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, the Spanish are pursuing their own strategy. They can't match Bartholomew's ships at sea anymore, so they go after his supply chain. They execute any miner in Cuba suspected of selling copper to pirates. Not just execution, public torture and execution, designed to terrorize anyone who might consider trading with Bartholomew. They station troops around copper deposits. They destroy small mines that aren't under official government control. The French, characteristically, try to buy what they can't steal or control. They offer 30,000 livres, an absolutely staggering sum for anyone who delivers Bartholomew's master shipwright alive. 30,000 livres would set up a person for life in luxury. It's enough money that people Bartholomew thought were loyal start having second thoughts. All of these pressure campaigns are building simultaneously. The copper supply is getting choked off. The crew's loyalty is being eroded. Foreign powers are coordinating against him, but Bartholomew doesn't know the full extent of the threat yet. How could he? He's still riding high from the post-hurricane supremacy, still believing that his copper ships make him invincible. Then comes November 1721, the Battle of Tortuga. 15 ships converge on Bartholomew's fleet near Tortuga. 15. This is unprecedented cooperation among groups that normally hate each other. There are British warships that survived the hurricane in other ports. There are Spanish vessels rushed from Havana. There are French privateers. And there are rival pirates, including Charles Vane, who has never forgotten or forgiven that midnight confrontation 3 years earlier when 12 of his men died. 15 ships against Bartholomew's 7. On paper, this should be a massacre. In reality, it becomes something else entirely. The copper hull's speed advantage proves decisive. Bartholomew's ships can sail circles, literal circles around their attackers. The traditional vessels, even the British warships with their professional crews and superior gunnery, can't maneuver fast enough to bring their cannons to bear effectively. Bartholomew's fleet uses tactics that wouldn't become standard naval doctrine for another 50 years. Sailing in line formation, concentrating fire on individual targets, using superior speed to choose the range of engagement. They rake enemy ships with cannon fire while staying just beyond retaliation range. The copper hulls slip through the water with such efficiency that Bartholomew's gunners can reload and fire faster because they're not constantly adjusting for their ship's movement. It's like watching a chess master play against amateurs. Every move Bartholomew makes creates multiple problems for his enemies. Every attempt they make to coordinate gets disrupted by the sheer speed difference. 12 enemy ships burn or sink, 12 out of 15. The British lose 2 warships. The Spanish lose 4 vessels, including a heavily armed galleon that cost the crown a fortune to build. Vane's ship gets so badly damaged that it sinks 3 days later. The battle lasts 7 hours, and by sunset, Bartholomew has achieved what should be impossible. A smaller force decisively defeating a much larger coalition. But during the chaos of battle, during those 7 hours of cannon fire and smoke and confusion, something crucial happens. Jonathan Hartwell sees his opportunity. He's been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. In the captain's cabin, while Bartholomew is on deck commanding the battle, Hartwell finds what he's been searching for: Bartholomew's personal journal. The journal contains detailed copper formulas, installation procedures, mixture ratios for the tar paste, everything. Hartwell steals the journal. He also steals a small boat, and in the confusion of battle, with smoke obscuring visibility and everyone focused on staying alive, he rows away. Nobody notices one man in one small boat disappearing into the chaos. By the time the battle ends, by the time Bartholomew realizes what's happened, Hartwell is gone. He makes it to a British warship that's retreating from the battle. He presents them with Bartholomew's journal. And just like that, the secret that has made Bartholomew invincible is in British hands. The greatest tactical victory of Bartholomew's career contains within it the seed of his complete destruction, because the British Admiralty now knows everything, and they're about to move very, very fast. So the British have the secret. Bartholomew's journal, containing years of accumulated knowledge about copper application, is now sitting on an admiral's desk in London. And here's what happens next. Here's where we see the absolute ruthless efficiency of the British naval establishment when they identify a technological advantage. They move fast, astonishingly fast for a bureaucracy that usually operates at glacial speed. Within 6 weeks of Hartwell delivering that journal, the British Admiralty issues orders to their shipyards in Portsmouth and Plymouth. Begin copper sheathing all naval vessels immediately. Priority Alpha. Spare no expense. The speed of this decision tells you everything about how revolutionary they understand this technology to be. But news travels in the Caribbean, even in 1722. Sailors talk in taverns. Dockworkers see British ships being modified. Spanish spies report back to their superiors. And eventually, word reaches Bartholomew. The British have your secret, and they're using it. Now, most men in Bartholomew's position would panic, or give up, or try to negotiate some kind of amnesty deal. Bartholomew does none of these things. Instead, he does something absolutely audacious, something so ambitious that it borders on delusional. He decides to establish a permanent pirate nation in Madagascar, where copper deposits exist and where he could sustain an independent operation indefinitely. Madagascar. Think about what this means. It's halfway around the world from the Caribbean. Getting there requires crossing the Atlantic, rounding the Cape of Good Hope, and sailing into the Indian Ocean. It's months of dangerous voyage, through waters controlled by various European powers. But Bartholomew has convinced himself that if he can just get to Madagascar with his core fleet intact, he can build something permanent, not a temporary pirate haven like Nassau, but an actual functioning nation with its own copper mines, its own shipyards, its own sustainable economy. It's a beautiful dream. It's also completely impossible. See, Bartholomew makes a crucial strategic error. He becomes paranoid. This is understandable. His greatest secret has been stolen. Foreign navies are adopting his technology. He knows people in his own crew were potentially involved in Hartwell's escape. But his response to this paranoia destroys what remains of his crew's loyalty. He starts executing people, anyone suspected of treachery, anyone who questions his Madagascar plan, anyone who seems insufficiently enthusiastic about the voyage. Over his final months, Bartholomew executes 37 crew members. 37 men, many of whom served with him for years, who helped develop the copper application process, who fought beside him in multiple battles. Some of these executions are probably justified. There were almost certainly actual spies and saboteurs in his crew. But 37? That number tells you that Bartholomew has lost his judgment, that the man who once built loyalty through selective trust has become a tyrant who sees traitors everywhere. The crew that remains is terrified and resentful. They follow orders because they're more afraid of Bartholomew than they are of the British Navy. But that kind of fear-based loyalty is brittle. It shatters the moment a better option appears. That option appears on March 7th, 1722, when Bartholomew attempts his final raid. He's desperate for supplies for the Madagascar voyage: food, water, medicine, spare timber. So, he attacks Charlestown Harbor in Carolina. Charlestown, an established colonial city with fortifications and a garrison and artillery batteries. It's the kind of target that pirates normally avoid because the risk-to-reward ratio doesn't make sense. But Bartholomew isn't thinking clearly anymore. He's fixated on this Madagascar dream, and he needs supplies, and Charlestown is right there. So he attacks. The British, anticipating exactly this kind of desperate move, have stationed 73 Marines in Charlestown specifically to ambush Bartholomew if he shows up. 73 Marines who have been training for months on how to board a copper-hulled vessel. They've studied the stolen journal. They know the smooth copper surface won't hold grappling hooks properly, so they've developed new techniques using gunpowder charges to blow holes in the hull first, creating anchor points for boarding. The battle for Eternal Serpent lasts 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous bombardment. The British bring every cannon in Charlestown to bear on this one ship. They're not trying to capture it anymore, they already have the copper secret, so the ship itself has no value. They're trying to destroy it, to eliminate Bartholomew, to send a message to every pirate in the Atlantic that the age of piracy is ending. And Bartholomew, to his credit, or his damnation depending on how you look at it, refuses to surrender. His crew is begging him to strike the colours, to save their lives, to accept that it's over. He executes 3 men for suggesting surrender. 3 men shot on deck while cannonballs are literally tearing through the ship around them. Think about what this scene looks like. The ship is being systematically destroyed. The copper hull that protected against shipworms and storms can't stop concentrated artillery fire. Holes are appearing in the sides. Water is rushing in. Men are dying. And Bartholomew is standing on deck, soaked in blood and seawater, still issuing orders, still firing back at the British positions on shore, still refusing to accept defeat. The end comes when a concentrated barrage strikes the captain's cabin where Bartholomew has retreated to coordinate the defense. Multiple cannonballs hit simultaneously, tearing through the reinforced structure. When his surviving crew members finally reach him, they find Bartholomew alive but mortally wounded, buried under debris, his legs crushed beyond any hope of recovery. His last words are recorded by Thomas Morton, a gunner who survived and later testified at Admiralty proceedings. Bartholomew, bleeding out, barely able to speak, looks at his remaining crew and says, "Let them steal copper, but never the courage to use it first." It's a hell of a final statement, defiant to the absolute end. No regrets, no apologies, no plea for mercy, just the assertion that even though the British stole his technology, he was the one who had the vision to implement it when everyone else thought him mad. He dies, approximately 20 minutes later. The surviving crew surrenders immediately. There's no reason to keep fighting once Bartholomew is gone. He was the only thing holding this desperate venture together through sheer force of will. But here's where the story takes a turn from history into legend, from documented fact into folklore that sailors will repeat for generations. The executions of those 37 crew members in Bartholomew's final months create something that haunts Caribbean waters long after the events themselves. Pirates and merchant sailors both start reporting strange phenomena. They see copper-green lights beneath the waves in areas where Bartholomew's ships sank. Not natural phosphorescence lights that move with apparent purpose, that seem to follow ships passing overhead. Cuban copper miners, working in the tunnels around Santiago, swear they hear voices speaking English, not contemporary English, the English of the early 1700s, with its particular phrases and pronunciations. They hear what sounds like mining operations happening in sealed-off sections of the mine system, sections that haven't been worked in decades. Now, are these stories true? Almost certainly not. They're the kind of legend that develops around any figure who dies dramatically and leaves a powerful impression on the cultural imagination. But the fact that these stories persist, that they're told and retold and embellished, tells you something about the impact Bartholomew had. He scared people. Even dead, he haunted them. The transformation that follows Bartholomew's death happens with remarkable speed. The British Navy, now equipped with the complete copper application knowledge, begins a massive retrofitting program. Within 5 years, just 5 years, copper sheathing becomes standard on all British naval vessels. Every ship of the line, every frigate, every patrol sloop gets copper hulled. The operational impact is staggering. Before copper sheathing, a British warship stationed in the Caribbean could expect a service life of about 3 years before the hull became so compromised it had to be scrapped or completely rebuilt. With copper sheathing, that service life extends to 12 years. 12 years. The economic implications alone are revolutionary. The Navy can maintain a permanent Caribbean presence without constantly replacing vessels. But the human impact might be even more significant. Mortality rates aboard ships drop by 60%. 60%. This is primarily because the diseases spread by rats and other vermin essentially disappear. No more rats means no more typhus, no more plague, no more of the pestilential conditions that made naval service nearly suicidal. Scurvy and other dietary diseases remain problems. Copper doesn't solve everything, but the elimination of pest-borne illness transforms naval service from a death sentence into a survivable career. This creates something unprecedented: professional sailing families. Before copper sheathing, men didn't want their sons joining the Navy because the death rate was so high. After copper sheathing, naval service becomes a legitimate career path. Families develop where 3 generations serve on warships. This professionalization of naval forces gives Britain an enormous advantage over other European powers who are slower to adopt the technology. The British use this advantage to establish permanent naval stations throughout the Caribbean and around the world. These aren't temporary deployments anymore. These are sustained occupations. British ships can stay on station for years, projecting power continuously rather than intermittently. This is what enables Britain to enforce colonial rule so effectively in the latter half of the 18th century. The sun never sets on the British Empire in large part because British ships can now stay at sea long enough to make that global presence sustainable. The economic ripples extend far beyond naval operations. Copper becomes as valuable as silver virtually overnight. Nations scramble to identify and control copper deposits. The price of copper increases by 400% between 1722 and 1730. Indigenous communities in South America and Africa, who know where copper deposits exist, suddenly have leverage they never had before. Colonial powers have to negotiate with people they previously ignored or exploited, because those people control access to a strategic resource. The copper mines of Cuba, the ones Bartholomew raided back in 1719, become some of the most valuable real estate in the Spanish colonial system. The Spanish invest heavily in expanding these operations, in improving refining techniques, in transporting more copper back to European shipyards. Similar developments happen in Swedish copper mines, in Japanese deposits, in Cornwall, where British copper has been mined since ancient times. But here's something fascinating. The indigenous knowledge that Bartholomew learned from the Taino divers gets lost. The British adopt the technical application process from his journal, but they never really understand the deeper context, the traditional knowledge that informed Bartholomew's initial discoveries. It takes modern maritime archaeology to rediscover that pre-Columbian Caribbean peoples used copper to protect their canoes, that this knowledge existed long before European navies stumbled onto it. Today, every modern ship can trace its technological lineage back to Jack Bartholomew. Every vessel with a metal hull, whether copper or steel or titanium, is a descendant of those first experimental copper plates applied to Serpent's Dream. The anti-fouling paints used on modern ships are direct descendants of that tar and copper mixture that Bartholomew's crew developed. The entire science of marine corrosion protection, a multi-billion-dollar industry, starts with a pirate who learned metalworking in Bristol and listened to indigenous divers in Cuba. There's a footnote to this story that I find particularly striking. In 1745, 23 years after Bartholomew's death, the British Navy commissions a ship named HMS Bartholomew. It's the only time in Royal Navy history that a ship is officially named after a pirate. The official explanation is that it's named after the Apostle Bartholomew. But everyone knows the truth. The Navy is acknowledging, however indirectly, that their global supremacy is built on technology stolen from a man they hanged in effigy, a man they hunted to death in Charlestown Harbour. The golden age of piracy essentially ends with Bartholomew. There are pirates after him. Of course, piracy continues in various forms for decades. But the romantic era of pirate havens like Nassau, of pirate fleets challenging colonial powers, of individual captains holding strategic advantage through cunning and courage, that era ends when British ships gain copper hulls. Once the Royal Navy could maintain permanent Caribbean patrols with ships that didn't rot, piracy became unsustainable as anything more than isolated raiding. Bartholomew died believing his legacy had been stolen. He didn't live to see that his real legacy wasn't the copper technology itself, but the proof that innovation could trump tradition, that listening to marginalized knowledge could defeat established power, that a metalworker's apprentice from Bristol could force the greatest naval power in history to completely transform its fleet. He chose copper over gold, when everyone told him he was mad, and in doing so, he changed maritime history forever. That's the story of Jack Bartholomew, the Copper King, the pirate who accidentally ended the age of piracy by being too successful. A man who learned from indigenous divers, freed African sailors, and ancient Portuguese legends. A man who built an empire from stolen copper and lost it to a British spy. A man whose paranoid final months don't erase the revolutionary impact of his achievements. History remembers him now, if it remembers him at all, as a footnote in the development of naval technology. But for a few years in the early 1720s, Jack Bartholomew commanded the fastest ships in the Caribbean, defeated combined fleets, and forced the colonial powers of Europe to acknowledge that the age they dominated was ending. All because he understood something simple. The ship that doesn't rot rules the sea.